Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the, I don't actually know the exact number, but the fourth session that we're having with yourself, Omar, in the latest sort of series of Islamicate book reviews. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Omar Anchassi again for, unfortunately, your final week on this stretch, and I hope, inshallah, you'll be joining us again in the not too distant future. To discuss Mustafa Banister's book, The Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo, 1216 or 61 to 517. 61. Out of the Shadows, a wonderful subtitle, based on his dissertation, of course, which I think was finished at McGill. So the usual format, Omar will be introducing the book for about 10-15 minutes, and then I will launch into a conversation with him. We're both a little short on time today, so we're going to actually conclude just after the hour, inshallah. But hopefully, and it's a bit unfortunate because this is such a sort of, this is actually a very rich and copious book. It could fit into two books. And I have to apologize in advance because I actually only got my hands on the dissertation. I couldn't get my hands on, I didn't reach out to the publishers early enough. So I will remind everyone that you're welcome to ask any questions, which we'll try and take up in the last 15-20 minutes or so. And please remember to like, follow and subscribe. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Osama. This is, as you correctly note, a very copious book. And the title, or I should say the subtitle of the book, reflects an important point of departure for Banister's work, Out of the Shadows. He notes from the outset that in the Western historiography of the Abbasid Caliphate in its time in Cairo, this notion that the caliphate is a shadow caliphate or a kind of shell of its former self is often commented on. And the idea of a shadow caliphate, he notes, finds no analog in Arabic terminology, which is an important thing to point out. This book is really two books. It's firstly an actual political institutional history of the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo from 1261, all the way until the demise of that institution with the Ottoman conquest of Syria and Egypt in 1516 to 17, although the final caliph, al-Mutawakkil III, actually outlasts the conquest and lives for a few years, dying in the 1520s. But nonetheless, he is the final caliph in the Abbasid line and is not succeeded, although in a subsequent century, some of his descendants appear as financial administrators in the Ottoman Empire. Now, so the first half of the book is really this institutional and really political history, focusing on a number of things. Of course, the establishment of the Abbasids in Cairo and their kind of meandering journeys and their investiture with the Caliphate in 1261. And I will discuss that more and revisit it in just a bit. And the author is especially interested in their interactions with the various Mamluk sultans in Egypt and the, you could say, varied fortunes of the Abbasid caliphs and the individual Abbasid caliphs as personalities, because they have very different profiles. Some of them are more inclined towards the pursuit of scholarship and piety, although they're never scholars of the first rank. Others get involved in factional intrigues. And in the year 1412, for all of about 2.5 months, one Abbasid caliph, al-Musta'in, is actually the sultan as well. So in theory, at least, he has full untrammeled executive authority, is able to appoint and dismiss and so on and so forth. Although al-Mu'ayyad Sheikh later kind of strips him of actual executive power. But for this brief moment, for the first time in centuries, it could be argued, some would say it's an illusion from the outset, that the caliph kind of reunited these functions of the executive and the kind of more, you could say, moral, spiritual, religious functions of the caliphate. Unlike had been the case under the Abbasids at the height, under someone like Harun al-Rashid or al-Ma'mun, under the Abbasids of Cairo, really it's and I'm not sure if this is the correct terminology to use, perhaps we can say more about this, Usam, or discuss it together. The religious elements of the caliphal office come to be emphasized and foregrounded. The second half of the book is interested, you could say, in again, there is discussion of the institutional dimensions of the Abbasid Caliphate, but especially the intellectual history of this institution during the Mamluk period. So you have 5 chapters, beginning with a discussion of the normative literature, especially works of explicitly political thought, mirrors for princes literature, these kinds of documents on which there's lots of scholarship, of course, but a few sources brought to our attention. And the chapter after this is focused on the the Abbasid caliphs in the Mamluk historiography. And you find a range of attitudes among historiographers. Some are somewhat skeptical of the limits of the office, like al-Maqrizi. Others are very fulsome in their praise and take this institution much more seriously, although it should be pointed out that all of the chroniclers and historians really accept the office. All of them seem to take more or less for granted, or certainly the vast majority of them, the lineage claims of the Abbasids, something I'll revisit when I talk about how the Abbasid Caliphate comes to be reestablished in Cairo. Right. I think Abu al-Fida, the Hamawi Ayyubid princeling, who's a kind of Mamluk vassal, does mention in his chronicle that there are some whisperings that, well, this is not really, his lineage is not really proven, but in the vast majority of times, chroniclers and historians seem to disregard this possibility. And so after this discussion of the historiography, you have really 2 chapters looking at documents, especially documents of investiture known as taqlid. And this is a very interesting genre, and one thinks most immediately of examples like al-Qalqashandi in his Subh al-Asha, who preserves all of these documents of appointment and so on for various offices, including the Caliphate and so on. And Banister also looks in these 2 chapters at things like numismatic evidence. How did the caliph figure on coins, for instance? And finally, you have a kind of general conclusion that ties some of the themes of the book together. But it is a very rich book. It's really 2 books, as I said. And lots of interesting angles. And of course, we can't do justice to it in this short time. But a number of things that were very interesting to me that we can perhaps explore together. Sure. Things like the relationship of the Abbasid Caliph with outsiders, Muslim potentates and sultans outside of Mamluk territories. And things like requests for decrees of investiture and so on, and ceremonial robes or khil'ah and so on that would be conferred on these rulers, a sign of great prestige. That's an interesting angle to explore. Also, the normative literature, as always, is very interesting. And what exactly the relationship was between individual Mamluk sultans and the Caliphate, and also what the people, the commoners, the awam, had to say. Although Banister notes in more than one place, it's not always clear. With chroniclers like Ibn Iyas, one does get a better sense of what the commoners think and how they feel in this regard. Our case as historians is not helped by the fact that some historians will use the term an-nas, which is very ambiguous. It can refer either to the citadel elite the Nas and the Awlad al-Nas being the children, this kind of Mamluk elite, or it can refer to the commoners. So that's not always clear. But generally speaking, I think, particularly from the first part of the book, one does get the general impression that the caliph was popular,
Right.
although individual caliphs did not merit the regard of the ulama, such as al-Wathiq, who was appointed in place of or he kind of replaced the actual Wali al-Ahad and was eventually removed from office.
Sorry, what was unusual about his situation?
He was the caliph had designated somebody else to succeed him as caliph, but more problematically for the ulama, al-Wathiq was not a very moral individual, and he indulged in frivolous pastimes such as cockfighting and ram fighting and gambling on these. And these sorts of things.
Right.
As I said, individual Abbasid caliphs did have very distinct profiles, but there were periods when they were noted for their piety. As I said, they were never among the first, or even frankly the second rank of scholars, but they did often have very close relationships with individual ulama of extreme learning and prestige, such as As-Suyuti, who had a very fascinating relationship with the caliph. And in fact, although the caliph was made to rescind this decree, As-Suyuti had himself invested as the Qadi Kabir, the grand judge, who in theory had jurisdiction over all appointments across all of Islamdom, which the 4 chief Qadis of the Mamluks were obviously not happy about. Right. Anyway, the caliph was made to rescind this decree. And also figures like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and so on. So the caliph did have this role, and there were times, I can't say it was a constant feature of the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo, where the caliph would, for instance, deliver khutbahs and so on. So reflecting some of the classical ideas about the duties and responsibilities of a caliph. But overwhelmingly, the caliph is important really as a symbol in a number of respects, not just a symbol of the Ummah and the kind of wielder of this tremendous authority, but also symbolizing Mamluk jihad efforts, and very important, of course, as a legitimator of Mamluk jihad against its enemies. Right. There were a number of occasions where the enemies were denounced as effectively apostate, so this didn't happen very commonly.
Or at least Khawarij ala al-Imam, so to speak.
Yes, I haven't really come across that term specifically in the book, but yeah. And I should end on this point in terms of, by way of introducing the book. There's a line really towards the end of the book where Banister says, and because we don't know him personally, we'll refer to him by his surname, something along the lines of, the fact that people believe you have authority means you have it.
Right.
Authority is different from power. Yes, you can say quite comfortably that the Abbasid caliphs of Cairo didn't have power, at least in the narrowly political sense. They did not have an army to support their claims, unlike Mamluk elites. But they did possess authority. Right. Banister also suggests towards the end of the book that mistreatment of the caliph could result in some form of civil unrest. Right. Although there were periods where, for instance, one caliph was exiled to Qus along with his dependents for 4 years or so. Other caliphs were exiled to Alexandria, and many caliphs were confined to their residences, if you like. And the Mamluk sultans were often quite jealous of their authority, which they would try not to flout publicly. So there was a certain amount of deference, at least, symbolic deference, you could say. But there were periods where, for instance, they were very picky about who was allowed to visit the caliphs in their residences. Religious scholars, ulama, generally had greater flexibility in visiting than, say, ranking emirs.
Right. That could be a subversive act, so to speak.
Sure.
So, Jazakumullah khairan. I mean, on this just last point about authority, I thought. So I've got a whole host of potential questions that we could explore over the course of the next hour or so. But one of the things about authority, and I wonder if you can potentially sort of suggest where's a good locus for research on this. I often think about it with respect to modern debates that come up with respect to the suggestion that the way in which the qadis in Islamdom historically would have been appointed by the the caliph or something like that meant that the system was open to abuse and things like this. And this is sometimes more popular discourse rather than serious scholarly discourse. I just find it sort of very unusual how we, of course, live in governmental structures where authority is all important. The fact that we respect the law and we recognize that we have a given figure or a given political party in a parliamentary system like our own as the ruler or as the sort of political authorities de facto, even if you take into consideration the head of state being someone else, gives a certain kind of order to society that is really simply sort of a kind of gentleman's or gentlewoman's agreement, if that's an expression. And for some reason, I think there's this, not in someone like Banister's work or not serious historical scholarship, but sometimes even in relatively serious scholarship, there creeps in these ideas that, that's not really how it worked in the medieval era. It was basically by brute force. And I think the existence of the caliph is an illustration, particularly. I'm thinking about what's her name's book, Longing for the Lost Caliphate, Mona Hassan's book.
Mona Hassan being a significant interlocutor in this book, of course.
Right, of course, and who finished her work sort of not long before he finished his PhD, as I understand, and so he's citing him in the dissertation, citing her, in the dissertation, at least her dissertation, and I just sort of I found quite striking the importance of the caliphate, but also the fact that it does have this authority. It wields authority in a genuine way. Thought.
Yes, that's a really interesting question that in some respects one could say is at the heart of the book, this dynamic or interplay between power and authority.
Right.
What I would say is that when thinking of the modern state, power is relatively centralized in pre-modern context because of all kinds of limitations. It is, in important respects, diffuse.
Right.
So even in the time of Al-Ma'mun, who was an actual caliph who wielded real power, someone like his general Tahir in the east also had significant power, and people even talk of a Tahirid dynasty, his governor in Khurasan and so on. Power is not institutionalized in quite the same ways as it is in the modern, think of Weber's notion of rational bureaucratic authority versus charismatic versus and so on, traditional. And
I
also,
wonder, if I may, I just wonder in terms of that sort of modern centralization of power. As you say, it's in a sense the modern state as understood today is often defined as the institution that has a legitimate monopoly over violence, and that's quite an interesting sort of aspect to this, in a sense. Aside from the West, where there's kind of this, there are actually norms observed in terms of the limitations of state aggression against the populace. In an almost Foucauldian sense, sort of. I forget the expression. Technologies of the self and the notion of biopolitics, and the fact that we've kind of come to an agreement that we are going to be subservient to the state. But that violence is visited upon vast numbers of people in, all over the world when, they're unable to institute the sorts of institutions, often as a consequence of like post-colonial conditions and so on.
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent like that's also something that requires there to be less authority in a sense and more power in the modern circumstance compared to when we think about pre-modern context.
That's a very interesting question. And the Mamluk period is interesting for a variety of reasons. One of which is that you have this, you could say, deracinated elite in the until the late 14th century. The Mamluks are, slaves, Kipchak Turks and so on, and then Circassians and so on. Although Banister does point out that alongside this fact of slave elites and descendants of slaves, you also do have a dynastic impulse in the Mamluk period. So the Qalawunids from the end of the 13th century, and for most of the 14th in power, nearly a century. Right. And these are all the descendants of Qalawun.
Right.
And ideas about power are also based on notions of clientage and patrimonialism, very much distinct, at least in theory, from what we have, say, in democratic governments in the Western world today. Yeah. So the notion that, well, the goal of securing power is that you have control of the resources afforded by taxation and so on, and then you distribute these among your favorites and so on. And the Abbasid Caliph has to figure somewhere in that picture. So you have quite depressing stories of, for instance, when the Caliph, I think it's al-Muqtafi, if I'm not mistaken, is exiled to Khus along with his dependents. Right. His stipend goes from 5,000 dirhams to 1,000. Right. I believe it's dirhams. Okay. And so his means are very straitened, and there are reports that his womenfolk even have to sell their clothes to get by. Right. So, yes, I mean, power politics does come up against the sacred authority, if you like, of the caliph in ways that are sometimes very demeaning to the caliph personally.
Right. But, I mean, I wonder to, and I'd like to let you finish that point as you would like to, but I mean, this also happens in the pre-Mongol sort of period as well, right? I mean, you can think of the way in which the, I forget, Adud al-Dawla and trying to marry the sort of daughter of the Abbasid Caliphate, although in that sort of particular instance, the Abbasid Caliph is able to kind of delay and delay and delay, or
with Tughril Beg, certainly.
Sorry, Tughril Beg.
Yeah, so certainly, and this relationship with the caliph is in some sense a hostage or a victim of the sultan. Of course, goes back many centuries to really the, not just the Seljuks, but also the Buyids. So there is a kind of interesting parallel here as well. Although both the Buyids and the Seljuks were dynastic regimes to a much greater extent than the Mamluks, at least.
Okay, well, I mean, authority, I suspect specifically is covered in a certain amount of detail, and as I say, when I get my hands on the book rather than the dissertation, I look forward to sort of exploring those things in greater detail myself. I wanted to sort of ask about the question of Qurashiyya, because you kind of alluded to sort of, I forget, was it Abul Fida, who basically was saying something along the lines of, is this really an Abbasid? How can we verify
he mentioned some people are skeptical of the claims of the. So I should
because
say
there's
something.
There's no verification possible, as far as I understand, right?
I mean, so I should say something about the circumstances of the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo. So of course the last Abbasid of Baghdad, al-Mu'tasim, is unceremoniously killed in Baghdad in 1258. And you have a pattern whereby, as Banister says, west of the Euphrates you have these Abbasid claimants emerging. Normally they seek refuge with basically tribes in this region, tribal coalitions. And in the beginning, in the early 1260s, you have really two claimants, one of whom succeeds in making his way to Cairo first. So you have al-Musta'in, whom is the first Abbasid to be acclaimed as caliph in Cairo in 1261. Right. And then you have al-Hakim bi Amrillah, not to be confused with the more famous Fatimid caliph, who becomes caliph and when he makes it to Cairo eventually in 1262, although he is detained for a period and so on, and he is proclaimed as caliph in parts of Syria before eventually making it to the west.
So now that would have been simultaneous with the other chap. So you have contesting claimants.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, but he does end up actually succeeding him in Cairo. Why? Because what is the situation in Egypt? So shortly before that happens, the Mamluks, or the forebears, you could say, of the Mamluks, defeat the Mongols in 1260 at Ain Jalut in Palestine. And the kind of commander Qutuz is killed by, or involving a conspiracy with Baybar's al-Bundukhtari, who becomes the Mamluk ruler. So he comes to power in somewhat dubious circumstances, and you can obviously see how having the support of an Abbasid caliph would be a good thing to do. Right. If you're concerned about your legitimacy. Right. And of course, Baybars from the outset, and there are a number of Baybars, of course, during the Mamluk period.
Right. But this isn't, so there's a later Baybars who interacts with Ibn Taymiyyah fairly extensively.
Yeah, there are several.
Okay.
Al-Jashnikir and others. But Baybars al-Bundukhtari is the first one in the Mamluk context. And so he establishes, with great pomp and fanfare, the caliph. And this is one thing Banister pays quite a great deal of attention to in the book, is the actual performance of the caliphate. So a lot of importance is attached to things like ceremonies of investiture, the donning of these ceremonial robes, even in terms of how the caliph and the sultan are positioned vis-a-vis one another in official gatherings and processions and this sort of thing, all a great deal of importance. And these are public spectacles as well. So the commoners may have interacted with caliphs to this extent. Yeah. In many periods during Mamluk reign, one, perhaps even the most important or most accessible the caliph ever got to the commoners of Cairo, was in his capacity as, not throughout the whole period, but for substantial periods, custodian of the shrine and therefore recipient of its revenues and presumably neither of its awqaf of the shrine of Sayyida Nafisa in Cairo. And Banister describes from the sources how there would be a kind of trunk at the head of the shrine and money would kind of be gathered here. Right. And for some periods this was a source of substantial revenue.
Is this one of the al-Bayt shrines? I'm not familiar with.
Yes, in Cairo. Yeah, okay. So descendant of the Prophet ﷺ. Right. I mean, all of these shrines, one should be somewhat skeptical.
Of course,
if not very skeptical about.
Ibn Taymiyyah sort of famously attacked some of these shrines during his time.
Yes, so the supposed head of Al-Hussein in Cairo, he has a treatise on the head of Hussein. He says it's probably the head of some monk. Ahmad al-Shamsi, in his second book that we had an episode on, has a very fascinating discussion of the shrine of Al-Hussein, which basically materializes out of nowhere after several centuries of no one having reported that Al-Hussein's head, God be pleased with him, was available.
As a sort of anecdote on the side, so Sheikh Akram, my own teacher in fiqh and hadith, Sheikh Muhammad Akram Nadwi, once when we were studying, I think, Muwatta ibn Malik, he started commenting on a visit that he had paid to Syria, just I think in the last year or so. He writes travelogues periodically, so he's got a nice, I forget the name, he's got these rhyming titles for them, Ayyam fi Sham, but it's a lot nicer than that. And he commented that someone said to him, oh, this is the Maqam of Musa, or something along those lines. And that was in, I think, northern Damascus, and then he was another time in south Damascus and said, oh, this is the Maqam of Musa, or something. They said, wait, what? What's going on here? And then it might not have been Musa, this is a few years ago, but then his host was like, oh, don't you know there are like 50 maqams of Musa around here? I mean, that's probably an exaggeration, but yes, I mean...
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, honestly. You have this great comment of Stephen Greenblatt, I think, this Renaissance historian that we did mention in the previous episode in his book, The Swerve. Right. I believe it's... No, or is it Ayman Duffy? Anyway, so I think it's Duffy, sorry. Duffy characterizes late medieval Catholicism as and I'm paraphrasing somewhat, but it's more or less a cult of the living in the service of the dead. And in important respects, I mean, if you read books like Christopher Taylor's In the Vicinity of the Righteous, there's also, to some extent, the impression one gets of the practice of Islam in the Mamluk period, say in the 14th century, although it did have its detractors. Yeah. Banister mentions, drawing on Nathan Hoffer and the work of others, that certainly, at least by the late 14th century, Sufism was basically ubiquitous at all levels of society. Right. In Mamluk Egypt and Syria, with all that entailed in terms of the cult of saints and so on.
Yeah, and this is basically, a shift away from the kind of Zuhd-based Sufism that we were exploring in Christopher Melchett's book, towards this kind of folkloric and indeed Akbarian Sufism.
So I mean, for Melchett, as for all sensible historians of Sufism emerges later. It's preceded by Zuhd and Nusk and the Zuhaid and Nusak and so on, and then it receives a kind of... He talks about it in terms of the transition from asceticism in his famous paper to mysticism. Right. Although in his earlier paper, in his book, we discussed he generally avoids the term asceticism and speaks instead of renunciant piety. Right. But Banister does note, interestingly, that the office of caliph under the Mamluks does come to be quite inflected by ideals of Sufi piety. Remember in the last episode, Phil, when we discussed Phil's book, you spoke of the idea of religion as being protected by politics with this powerful symbol of an old man whom we kind of shelter and seclude. Right. I mean, in many respects, at least in some periods during Abbasids of Cairo, this is actually what happens, and the caliph is this secluded personality who might interact with religious elites and might be kind of wheeled out on special occasions, but otherwise does not enjoy the exercise of any power in the kind of real, meaningful political sense.
I wonder,
but as a locus of authority, tremendously important.
Yes, I mean, one thinks of we of course live in a constitutional monarchy, right? And the Queen, longest-serving monarch, I think, in the history of these isles, is someone who has maintained remarkable authority through her reign. But there were so many points in the history of the British Isles that you have a lot of contention between the government and the head of state.
For sure.
Yeah, so, I mean, when we're looking at other...
Concerns about boundaries of authority, absolutely.
Right. And so, I mean, in recent memory, of course, I mean, I actually live in Leicester, and I regularly visit a park, Bradgate Park, where it's the resting place of, I forget her name, I should know her name, but a person who was Queen of England for about 11 days. And we also have Richard III, who sort of is immortalized by Shakespeare. And, these were
was this the king found, who was the one
Richard III.
Ignominiously found buried under a car park?
Yes, well, I mean, Yes, he in a sense sort of reaped his his reputation, as it were, in sort of a few hundred years later. He was widely sort of considered a tyrant. But in any case, I mean, just the comment is that the ebbs and flow of these sorts of contention do not necessarily, I mean, what's interesting about the Mamluk situation that Banister is considering is no one actually goes and actually kills off the caliph in the way that, you know, contending figures would have done that in a place like the UK.
Yes,
the
this is really interesting. So he mentioned sanctity. Yes, this is the word I would use. There is one case, in fact, where the caliph is accused, and the Mamluk Sultan, who's escapes me which one precisely,
right,
is accused of actually conspiring against the Sultan, and is threatened with execution, although it's ultimately not carried out.
Omar, if you'll forgive me for a minute, someone's just knocking on the door, so I will be back in just a moment. Please.
I should probably entertain this question we've received. Can you post it up on the screen just so I can read it out for the podcast? Fantastic. So for the podcast, I will read this out from Black Viper, interesting name. What was the actual role of the caliph as those with authority but no or little power? Were they simply paid to be a nominal figurehead? This is a really interesting question that really gets at the heart of some of the concerns of Banister's book. They did not really exercise political power. You know, they weren't appointing qadis and this sort of thing, as they had earlier in the Abbasid period proper. But the authority they enjoyed did actually have a kind of meaningfulness. So to give an example, Osama, we could dwell on for a moment. Sure. The Delhi sultans, for instance, in the 14th century and even beyond the 14th century, sought decrees of investiture from the Abbasid Caliphs of Cairo. So they would send diplomatic missions laden with gifts. They would return with an official document and ceremonial garb and so on, manifesting this grant of caliphal authority. And sometimes this would actually give them heft in their local dynastic struggles against contenders. So the caliph would say, you have authority over India, for example, or those territories over there. And I mean, this happened in places as far removed as, South Asia and also West Africa during the Mamluk period. So that in itself, I think, speaks to the fact, as Banister concludes at the end, that this authority is being taken seriously means it has some kind of real world effects, if you like.
Can I
sure.
kind of add in here? So this is a point I've almost certainly made in the course of previous sessions, where drawing on Noah Feldman's Fall and Rise of the Islamic State, one of the things that happens with the legal fiction that the caliph is investing the sultan with power, which is...
This idea of tafweed or delegation.
Right, or imaratul istila, man istawla ala sultan, and then engaging in that sort of tafweed, which is, I don't know if al-Mawardi is the most prominent figure to sort of articulate this, but presumably he's talking about something which is in the air among the ulama around when he's writing. And the power of that in Feldman's estimation, and I find this a reasonably compelling argument, is that it normalizes a situation and continues the entrenchment of ulama authority. And so I think, I wonder what you think of that sort of...
Yeah, so Feldman, as I remember his argument, basically reverses, for instance, Gibbs' assessment of Mawardi.
Right.
And he says, well, Mawardi in a difficult situation is really trying to continue and perpetuate the rule of law, which is what's important for him to use these anachronistic terms.
Yeah, he says the Sharia.
Yeah, which makes sense for me. I would say one thing one notices on the in terms of the normative chapter, al-Mawardi was hugely influential in the political thought of the Mamluks.
Right.
Really, I mean, almost omnipresent.
Fascinating.
And even often decrees of investiture are kind of framed in quite Mawardian tones, you could say.
Right. I mean,
now,
he only dies like 1058, so it's not even 200 years, right? Oh, it's around 200 years.
That's a fairly long time. But
it's a fairly long time, yeah. I mean, I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of the distance between Mawardi and today. But yes, it's fascinating that he still looms so large in the Mamluk consciousness.
Yeah, one thing that's fascinating is you did have these periods where it's not clear exactly what significance this has, but Banister does mention cases where I think Khanas al-Ghawri, the last Mamluk, or the one who's defeated by Salim at Marj Dabiq, for instance, is addressed as the kind of caliph, right. Even though he's the Sultan. There is an actual caliph, al-Mutawakkil III. So, right. And especially when one comes to the early modern Islamic period, a number of scholars have commented on this, and Banister engages with their work. People like Hussein Yilmaz and Caliphate Redefined and many others. Right. Something we have touched on in previous episodes. Yeah. You could say in some respects the caliphate as an institution ideologically comes to be transformed in the early modern period, and also comes to be just one among several rhetorical kind of tropes in the arsenal of political power and sovereignty. Right. So he talks about, very interestingly, that one of the Abbasids of Caliph sends an investiture decree, but also ceremonial robes to Mehmet II, the conqueror of Constantinople. And Banister mentions the reaction, which is utterly contemptuous. Mehmet orders the robe shredded and says that I'm the caliph of Islam and the Muslims, so, effectively.
That's interesting.
This is in 1453.
Like, yeah, I mean,
it happens before. I think. Well, it happens in the mid 15th century. Put it that way.
Right. But I mean, okay. So I didn't read that sort of far into the text, but.
I would assume this is an attempt to placate Mehmet, because of course the Mamluks, especially in the later 15th century, were engaged in this rivalry that ultimately ended.
Right.
In 1516-17, the victory of the Ottomans, as your colleague Eugene Rogan says in his excellent book, this kind of history of the Arabs, yeah. Which actually begins with scenes from Marj Dabiq.
Right.
He says the Mamluks made the classic mistake of, how does he put it, like bringing cavalry to a gunfight or something like this. So the Ottomans had superior gunpowder technology, and this is a major reason, it seems, for their victory over the Mamluks.
Right. I mean, so just one other point that I'd add to, in a sense, the question, which is talking about sort of having little power and being a nominal figure, is that yet, and this is so well as illustrated in Mona Hassan's book, it is seen as necessary. It is seen as absolutely essential to have the caliph there, from a religious perspective, and so there's this kind of celebration of its reinvestiture, as you put it, and scholars write about it, and they sort of participate in that reinvestiture process. So just to understand, like, to what extent is that my impression, sort of in reading the, not terribly widely, is that this is more or less a consensus view in the pre-modern tradition, which is then brought into question in the modern period, that we need a caliph, right? Yeah,
so...
But this is in the Sunni tradition.
I mean, at least in the chapter on normative literature,
right,
and even the historiography,
right,
they do... The authors surveyed by Banister do broadly accept the importance of the caliph, right, and the necessity in important respects. Now, some of them are quite skeptical as to this point about power. So
Right.
Ibn Taymiyyah with his, in Manhaj as we've seen in a previous week on Nabil Hussein's book, makes this point about caliphs or imams as those who possess actual power to rule.
Right.
And that an imam without power is, as good as an imam who doesn't exist. This is critique of the Shiite imamology.
I mean, that's interesting.
You do get elements of that.
That's a polemic he's leveling towards.
For sure.
I mean, to what extent? I haven't.
So
read
you get elements of it in terms of in the historiography of some authors writing history works.
Right.
But they nonetheless accept the legitimacy of that. I mean, none of the authors Banister discusses whether historians or many of the historians are ulama, but ulama as well writing works of normative ethics.
Right.
None of them don't refuse to accept the legitimacy of the Abbasid Caliph. None of them don't accept the legitimacy of his claims to be an Abbasid.
Right.
So this is pretty much uniform.
Sorry, the fact that there is a need for a caliph is what did you
it's
think?
basically taken
it's taken for granted
to a large extent, taken for granted. And Mona Hassan of course illustrated in her book that what a calamity in 1258 for nearly 4 years, around 4 years.
So does Banister reflect on the sort of, obviously he's looking just at the Mamluk period really, but does he reflect on, towards the end of the work, on the contemporary circumstance, which is very unusual and sui generis in Islamic history, aside from those 3 years between the...
No, there is no discussion of or allusion to this at all. And I respect that. I mean, the book is ambitious in terms of what it achieves, and it makes sense that he has to draw the line somewhere and limit his scope somehow.
So let me sort of, in that case, jump to something which is more within his scope, which is the way in which the Ottomans come and sort of take over that role. And this kind of goes back to the question of lineage, I suppose. So the Ottomans are coming, I'm just thinking, 1517 is when they really sort of come and take over. But when it comes to, they're already ascendant in the 15th century, very clearly. And I wonder to what extent when people like Ibn Hajar, if I recall correctly, this is in Fath al-Bari, is saying something along the lines of, Qurashiyya is something which is desirable, but not, if in the absence of that, then you can have sort of other people. To what extent is that a reaction to his circumstances, his times?
Well,
I wonder if Banister sort of addresses.
Even in thinking back to the episode on al-Juwayni, you have figures who are, and Ibn Khaldun himself, of course, famously relinquishes the Qurashiyya condition with kind of based on sociological observations to do with, well, in the Prophet's time they had the Asabiyya and they had this authority over other tribes and so on, and that's no longer the case. You do find that as a trend in Mamluk political thought. I would still say it's the minority view. Ibn Taymiyyah does insist on the Qurashi attribute of the caliph, for instance. Initially...
how do we understand the Ottomans? I mean, as far as I understand, the Ottomans kind of like concocted lineages for themselves. But I don't know if anyone took them seriously. I haven't studied the period. So
Hassan mentioned that in the 16th century you have books basically challenging the Qurashi, basically works of, you could say, Ottoman propaganda challenging the essential, the attribute of Qurashiness in a caliph. But I mean, that tendency had already existed before the Ottomans were prominent on the political stage in the Arabophone Middle East. So it's not an entirely novel development. Although, Al-Mutawakkil III outlives Salim, the Ottoman Salim.
Salim the Grim.
Or Salim the Sat, he's also known as. It seems he had the fondness for wine. And actually survives, as I said, into the reign of Sulayman, who allows him to return to Egypt, if I'm not mistaken. But initially, there was an attempt by Qanas al-Ghawri to rule as the kind of governor on behalf of the Ottomans, and eventually he was pressured away from this, and things go kind of pear-shaped, and the Ottomans end up entering Egypt and ruling there. And the Abbasid Caliph is in fact deported along with a number of Mamluk elites as well to Istanbul. And Banister notes there is apparently great mourning and grief among the commoners in Cairo when this happens.
Right. Fascinating. I mean, and that you can understand in a sense, in that on a couple of levels. One is, the illustration you've mentioned that emerges periodically in these public sort of expressions of happiness at the point of investiture, and here you're saying grief in terms of when that is lost. But also the prestige of Cairo would plummet.
Absolutely. Something Ahmed al-Shamsi in important respects emphasizes in his book. I mean, just the transition in terms of historiography, the provincialization, we would say, of Egypt. And that is the case. I mean, the arrival of the Abbasids in Cairo, I mean, even in the investiture documents and certainly in the historiography, you find lots of references to Egypt as the Qubbat al-Islam and the part of the crown, if you like, of the Baydat al-Islam, the kind of domain of Islam. And all of this language, which is actually very meaningful in the context of, a triumphant Mamluk regime that has managed to stop to some extent or check the advance of the Mongols, legitimated by the presence of the Caliph. So it is meaningful.
It's a confluence of factors that are quite significant at the time. I just wanted to look at, there was a question from our friend. He apologizes for his name, so to speak.
Nothing wrong with it.
I think
quite cool,
the online sort of world is perfectly welcoming of this kind of innovation. So he says, I recall reading that Aurangzeb asked for investiture from the Sharifs of Mecca. Were there any rivalries between the Abbasid authority? That sounds a bit odd to me.
I haven't read of that specifically. I haven't read of Aurangzeb specifically. I mean, as I say, in the early modern period, rulers in the gunpowder empires did tend to make extravagant claims of authority. This is not really something that features in the book to a great extent. Nor is the relationship with. Well, he does in terms of the relationship with the Sharif. For sure. Now, a number of Abbasid caliphs in Cairo do make Hajj, by the way, which is quite unusual. Well,
is it unusual?
You did have Abbasids who made Hajj as well. Harun al-Rashid and so on. But the Ottoman sultans famously never make Hajj, if I'm not mistaken. Not a single Ottoman sultan ever makes Hajj.
Okay, I was not aware.
While lavishing gifts and bestowing patronage on it.
How on earth was that justified by any of them?
I mean, all kinds of ways. And necessity is a capacious argument.
Right. So they're needed in the metropole and things like that.
So in terms of the Abbasids and the Sharifs, it's not really discussed in this book because that's not really the central point. But even under the Ottomans, there were tensions between the Sharifs and the Ottomans. You would have rebellions, for instance. Certain Sharifs sought to rule independently of the Ottomans, and this never ended well. And the Mamluks did have authority over the Hijaz and the pilgrimage and so on. So that was an additional element of their authority.
Did they ever take the title Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain?
Well, I did pay attention to that. In this book, I don't think he uses the term Khadim, but certainly I'm trying to remember, the custodian or the ruler or something like this. Now, Shawn Marmon in her book on eunuchs and sacred boundaries say says specifically that the title Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain was used no later than the Ayyubids, and I assume it was still in use. It was in use by the Mamluks as well. But this idea that they were responsible for the Haramain in some sense did occupy a quite prominent place in the rhetoric of legitimacy.
I wanted to sort of shift gears slightly with my next question, which is, I mean, you mentioned Suyuti a while ago, and you talked about the way in which he tried to institute himself as kind of grand Mufti,
Qadi Kabir.
al-Qadi al-Kabir, who would have the prerogative of appointing everyone, which is kind of, that's basically a Shaykh al-Islam position. I'm not sure if it had precedent at that point. Obviously, the Ottomans established that subsequently. I wanted to ask, in a sense, this may or may not be extensively discussed by Banister, but it's in a sense the transformations that take place in the early modern and modern periods is this centralization, this bureaucratization. What, as you said, Weber also talks about rationalization. And for me, what's interesting here is Suyuti kind of reflecting something which is taking place on a global scale, that he's trying to aspire to a recognition of a kind of bureaucratization of the state where he wants to, include himself and involve himself in that process.
That's a great question. In some senses, he foreshadowing this development, you could ask.
Right.
I think in the case of Suyuti, he does claim there are precedents, but I think it's purely down to ambition. He was an extremely ambitious chap and really attracted tremendous enmity among his peers, partly because of his brilliant, ambitious, somewhat cranky, and made many enemies, but he had the last laugh because we're reading his works today and not those of many of his detractors. Now, what's really interesting for me is, although there's no attempt to unpack it in the book, and there is a reference, I should say, no, the last Abbasid was not killed by Salim. We're getting a question about this. He didn't kill him, in fact. Now, I'll finish. No, in fact, none of the Abbasid caliphs were executed in office during under the Mamluks, which is, suggests their sanctity and so on. Now, he does refer several times into the book to a Shaykh al-Islam, and it's clear this is an official post in the late Mamluk period. We hope further light will be shed on this by Matthew Ingalls in his forthcoming book on Zakaria al-Ansari. So several times in the book, Banister refers to Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Shafi'i, who is none other than Zakaria al-Ansari, and you do find this title. In the case of Ibn Taymiyyah, it's clearly an honorific, and it doesn't reflect any kind of official position.
Right.
We've seen already in one of our very early episodes, James Pickett's book on Bukhara, that the Shaykh al-Islam was an actual position, and it didn't mean head of the religious establishment across the, in the Mangit territories. In that context, it was really in Bukhara or in Samarkand, in these kind of particularly important cities. But it's not clear when exactly this institution emerges or what significance it had. But bear in mind, I should say, by the way, because Suyuti dies in 1505.
Right.
The first Ottoman Shaykh al-Islam, Mullah Fannari, is appointed in 1425. So actually preceding by a number of decades this development.
This is kind of like the founder, in a sense, of it as an institution, him in collusion.
Yes, but for sure, the occupant of that office comes to be much more important after the conquest of Istanbul in 1453, because or of Constantinople, because as Abdurrahman Achal has argued, this is when the kind of religious bureaucracy really emerges, and the bureaucratization of the ulama post-conquest in the Ottoman context.
In a sense, my question is connected to this sort of bureaucratization. I mean, there are interesting debates that take place today about the codification of law and things like this, and the greater bureaucratization and the alignment, in a sense, with the state structure. And, this some scholars might argue, and I think Aisha Zarakal kind of signals this in a short piece she has on the notion of sovereignty, that in a sense there's a kind of trajectory that is being witnessed on a global scale with respect to the developments of history that lead to this greater bureaucratization. You could say the emergence of certain technologies that allow for the concentration of power, but also that are, they require massive investment that states really are in the position to make, but not sort of the average person. Whereas if you have enough people making swords, for example, at certain points in human history, that may give you a certain kind of there's the diffusion of power in a way that doesn't really isn't as possible, I think, in like early modern periods. I don't know. I'm sort of going.
I mean, if you look at the size of the Ottoman bureaucracy at the beginning of the 19th century and the end of the 19th century, it multiplies by I think it's a factor of around a dozen, or give or take somewhat. Right. Or even more. I mean, I don't have figures for the whole period.
Right.
But this is partly because of these massive, infrastructure projects and administrative reform that require basically a larger administrative class.
Right.
But one thing that capitalism does is unleash or
is it fair
lead
to
the creation
at
of.
This stage?
Well, in the 19th century.
Okay, you're talking about the 19th century.
Massive resort, in terms of capital accumulation and so on.
Right.
Modern states are just so much more incredibly wealthy than pre-modern dynastic ones. There's really no comparison.
Right.
And this is part of the reason why the Ottomans and the Egyptians are bankrupted by the infrastructure projects, because they don't have the money to finance this from taxation. They're large agrarian empires in the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire, even in the early 20th, was hardly industrialized. All of their guns had to be imported from the Germans in World War I. They couldn't manufacture them. Steam trains and so on imported. So it really unleashes this real tiger in terms of economic power.
So, I mean, I understand where
this is to the part from the book somewhat.
Yes, but I mean, it's a line of inquiry that sort of, if you'll forgive and indulge for a moment, kind of brings me to perhaps what could be our final sort of question before we round out the conclusion of the book. And basically, I'm thinking about the argument that is put forward by someone like Wael Hallaq, which is that, the modern state is an impossibility from an Islamic moral ethical perspective, right? It cannot be countenanced as Islamic. But certain historical trends seem to suggest that the modern state isn't going anywhere, right? And so, it really, his book, in a sense, articulates this paradox which we have, in a sense, been living with for well over a century at this point, which is, how can you reconcile these kind of the ethical norms of a Sharia tradition, so to speak, with this really extraordinarily powerful entity, historically unprecedented? I don't know if you want to briefly reflect on that before we
how do you square them? I mean, that's so, Halak has some interlocutors who do believe that we can square them, and these are people he critiques, and basically Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and so on, who believe that one can Islamize this Leviathan and tame it, if you like. Right. And Halak's response is, no, this is just not feasible for all kinds of reasons. Right. And the answer one gives to your question is basically a matter of perspective. Is one sympathetic to Halak's critique? And I am, in a number of respects, or not. I mean, certainly if you're a believer in, think of the Nahda and its participation in electoral politics and multi-party democracy, for them there's no problem. Right. But for Halak, this is a kind of blind spot, and they're missing the bigger picture. Right. But finally, we do have a comment I should.
We should, but I mean, just I'll put the comment up. Sorry, this is the.
So Jem, the brother of Bayezid, did make hajj. Jem was never a reigning sultan.
Yeah.
And he had an interesting. I mean, Jem is actually mentioned in Banister's book. He does have this interesting migratory journey.
Right.
And the Mamelukes try to get him back because he's a kind of pawn they can use in their games against the Ottomans. They try to attract him back from these, Italian states and principalities unsuccessfully, and he ends up dying. There's a great book, actually, Jem Sultan by Freely or Jonathan. I forget what his surname is.
I'm unfamiliar with
it. But anyway, it's the kind of adventures of this Ottoman prince in Renaissance Italy. They do try to pressure him to convert to Christianity, but he refuses and dies as a Muslim.
I guess, I mean, like the final point that you made still leaves open this sort of paradox that we've discussed over the course of this session, which is that as Banister highlights and as Mona Hassan highlights before him, there is this sense in which there's no difference of opinion among the jurists and the theologians that this is actually something that we do need, a caliphate. But there's the paradox in the modern period that the political dimension of a religious sort of tradition is not welcome in the public sphere, and that the state, in a sense, is inherently unethical from an Islamic perspective. And so, it creates an aporia.
Yeah, so I mean, while I would basically agree with your observation on the caliphate, I mean, these theorists in the Mamluk period, they do also disagree about what it looks like. Now, if you relinquish the condition or the requirement of Qurashiyya, then it's then almost anyone, at least in terms of genealogy and racial ethnic background, can fit the bill.
Sure. And that seems popular in the modern period, to be honest.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, did any of them envision the kind of polity we have today? No, I mean, for all kinds of reasons.
Right. So I guess we leave the aporia hanging as a good aporia should, so to speak, and let people sort of ponder over it. I wonder if you want to sort of round out your sort of reading of Banister's book. As you say, his dissertation was, I think, 550 pages, but the book ended up being a bit shorter than that. So I don't know if that's by virtue of sort of double spacing in the case of the dissertation, but it really seemed extremely copious.
Yes, I mean, it's his attention to the sources, I think, is exemplary, and
Absolutely.
He draws on a range of genres. And I think it's a model of how to, because he's interested, of course, in the actual political history of the period, but also other dimensions of the caliphate beyond the purely normative in the sense of what one would find in the juridical literature. So the performance of the caliphate is important, and there is an interesting, absolutely, and there is a literature on this. So I do commend the book to readers. Yes, I think that's an acceptable note on which to end the series, at least until we have an opportunity to resume it. That will depend on what happens in the future, really.
Inshallah. I mean, Omar, as you know, you're always welcome to sort of jump in for the Islamic book reviews. I'll be continuing with Islamicate authors next week, so I'll be sort of inviting Khadija Shayal to talk about her book about Islamic activism in Britain.
Fantastic.
So I'm looking forward to that. But as ever, Omar, I really am very grateful to you, for giving us insights into this fascinating and very important book.
And thank you, as always, to the author for taking the trouble to research and write it.
Research and write a very sort of very carefully, very widely read in the secondary and the primary literature piece of research, exemplary research. And so we finally close, I suppose, with thanks to Mustafa Banister and to our audience who've been with us for over an hour at this point. Jazakumullah khair, and assalamu alaikum.